This week's talk will focus upon sexual orientation and heterosexism. In the olden days, there was a term that was used about sexuality. It was referred to as sexual preference. In fact, there was professional literature referring to sexual preference, implying that a person makes a choice between alternatives about sexuality that are equally available to him or her. Since that time, we've come to understand that it is much less a matter of choice. It is not a matter of choice, in fact, but rather it's a much more stable quality, and the term now used is sexual orientation to refer to one's sexuality. Sexual identity looks more at how one labels himself or herself with both psychological and social components. But this is separate and apart, by the way, from gender identity, which we talked about in a previous learning unit. Just to look at some terms here that you may run across when you're exploring this topic, homophobia represents the fear and hatred of those who love and have sexual desire for those of the same sex. Heterosexism is an ideological system that denies, denigrates, and stigmatizes any form of behavior, identity, relationship, or community that is not heterosexual in nature. Heterocentrism focuses upon the centrality of heterosexuality in a culture and how that culture defines sexual attitudes, beliefs, feelings, behaviors, traditions, and roles, and norms, and institutions. The roots of all of these variations is in sexism, and supported by the institutions of society, is oftentimes manifested in acts of fear and hatred, represents discrimination and hurtful behaviors and attitudes, oftentimes intentional hurtful behaviors and attitudes, and is manifested in social customs and institutions, as well as in individual action, just like any other form of oppression we studied this semester. The American Psychological Association took homosexuality out of its diagnostic and statistical manual with the introduction of the DSM-3 revision in 1973. The view of homosexuality being psychopathological was replaced with an idea of a gay, lesbian, or bisexual orientation that is more stable and a more fixed positive identity. Gay and lesbian are terms that refer to men and women who not only engage in same-gender, sexual, or affectional activities, but who may also adopt a lifestyle of one degree or another associated with that orientation. The term queer has more recently been used by the LGBTQ community to denote a political stance as well as referring to sexual orientation. Some of the traditional values that we looked at early in the semester, such as marriage and the family and patriarchy, dictate that sexuality must be heterosexual, must occur within a marriage, be monogamous, have a reproductive potential, be non-commercial, be coupled, in other words, between two people, relational, associated with a relationship, and within the same generation and occur at home. It's not supposed to involve anything involving pornography, fetishism, sex toys, roles that are anything other than traditional male and female, and preferably missionary position sexual activity. So anybody with an alternative sexual orientation or alternative sexual interests are really left out of the picture here. And the dichotomy between gay and straight that many people seem to recognize has given way to more of an understanding that sexual orientation, very much like gender identity, is more of a continuum, with people at either end of the gay, straight, male-female continuum that may be exclusively one or the other, but with a significant number of persons somewhere in between. And I might add also, not necessarily attached to one particular point in the continuum, but for many individuals, the association on that continuum may be quite fluid. Institutional discrimination results in such problems for those with alternative sexual orientations in areas including such things as acquiring and maintaining employment, the protection of the judicial and legal system, education and training, acquiring services in health, safety, and social services, and also discrimination in religious and community life. These problems are shared by most all of the groups that we've talked about in the diversity studies this semester. And the problems in this area for those with sexual orientation that is outside the heterosexual orientation intersect with racism, sexism, and classism to create both institutional and psychosocial barriers to their healthy development. Historically, homosexuality was accepted in ancient times in different cultures such as Greece and Rome, but in later cultures that were influenced by the Abrahamic religions, and this really involves Judaic religions, Christian religions, and Islamic religions. The law and the church established that sodomy was a transgression against divine law or a crime against nature. Prior to colonization, a number of indigenous communities in the Americas had respected social roles for homosexual, bisexual, and gender non-conforming individuals. And in fact, in some contemporary Native American and First Nations community, these roles still exist and are referred to as two-spirit. The term homosexuality hasn't been around throughout time, and in fact, as late as the 1800s, it is believed that's when the term first appeared. The term heterosexuality was invented later in the same semester to contrast with the earlier term. Standards of contact between males and females of a non-sexual nature were much looser, particularly with males in the 1800s, and so it wasn't uncommon to find males expressing physical affection with each other, not necessarily of a sexual nature. But somewhere in the 1800s, and for different reasons that might make a very interesting sociological study, the culture became somewhat obsessed with identifying one's sexual orientation in the late 1800s, and this dichotomy between gay and straight, homosexual and heterosexual dates back to that time. So all of this, what it does really is points to the fact that this labeling of sexual orientation, this concept of sexual orientation, is a social construction that's really connected very much to history. You're probably familiar with the Stonewall Rebellion, which occurred in New York in 1969, and that's considered to be the birth date of the modern gay liberation movement. Growing political and social action developed among gays and lesbians after that, as well as beginning attempts at public education. A sense of community began to develop among gays and lesbians, and after a quarter century or more of political struggle, some members of sexual minorities found that it was more positive for them to move to larger communities where diversity was more accepted, and so migration was actually one adaptation to the struggles that they were experiencing during this time. Since that time, very strong attacks from political religious groups such as the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition, the Family Research Council, supposed research organizations such as Focus on the Family have since occurred. And one result of this has been that gay and lesbian communities have begun to collaborate more closely to counter some of the bigotry that has arisen. In the early 1980s, the existence of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, was first identified and became an impetus for community building in the population as well. But it also resulted in more justification for oppression and discrimination against individuals in the gay and lesbian population. The government response was very inadequate. In fact, it's been said that Ronald Reagan never spoke the term AIDS in his administration for several years while the problem began to surface in our society. So the governmental responses was really quite inadequate and led to even greater discrimination, which then led to more activism and militancy in the movement itself. With the political power of the religious right, there was a great deal of focus placed upon establishing marriage as being between one man and one woman. Bill Clinton has since indicated that although he was not in favor of this law, nonetheless, he felt it was necessary to sign it because the political forces to push this through Congress were so great at the time that if he had vetoed the measure, it was very possible that a movement would have been afoot to make it a constitutional amendment and thereby enshrining it in U.S. law for all time. So in 2013, the United States Supreme Court overturned the Defense of Marriage Act, saying that it was unconstitutional to define marriage as a union between one man and one woman. A couple of years later, in Obergefell versus Hodges, the court ruled by a very narrow majority, by the way, that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples by both the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And so as a result of that, all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the insular areas, those are the territories, are required to perform and recognize marriages of same-sex couples on the same terms and conditions as the marriages of opposite-sex couples, with all accompanying rights and responsibilities. States had begun to do this little by little during the early part of this current century, but this law made it a national mandate. Despite the changes in the law, of course, attitudes are slow to accompany those changes. Cultural homophobia and institutional heterosexism are all around us and are seen through such things as discrimination and marginalizing attitudes among the general population and even among our helping professions. There are repeated instances of gay and lesbian bashings. There's been a slow response to the AIDS crisis. There's a high rate of gay teen suicide, and all around the United States you'll hear of struggles to gain civil rights protections from state to state and city to city. This oppression against sexual minorities grows from patriarchy with all of its definitions of traditional and acceptable masculinity and femininity, and also from a concept of heterosexual privilege, which is really quite the same thing as the knapsack of white privilege that we learned about, that those who are heterosexual don't recognize the support that is inherent as a result, but those who are not heterosexual certainly do notice that difference. Part of this heterosexual privilege is the assumption that persons are heterosexual, thus qualifying the need for institutional support for those who are not. Although we've made advances in our society, legal and social support and protection still remain very tenuous in such areas as marriage, and social support is equally tenuous. Even those who are today getting married legally and in churches find oftentimes family members not attending those marriages or treating it in the same way as they would a heterosexual marriage. The political atmosphere with the federal courts and the United States Supreme Court becoming increasingly conservative in the current administration also threatens the stability of the progress that has been made in these areas. There are a lot of myths and assumptions regarding homosexuality that are very harmful. Included among these are that long-term relationships among gays and lesbians are uncommon, that alcohol and drug abuse is something that is most common with gays and lesbians, that children raised by gays and lesbians are more likely to become gay or lesbian themselves, that gays and lesbians are identifiable by their behavior or their physical characteristics, that they're more promiscuous than heterosexuals, that homosexuality is a psychological maladjustment, that almost all LGBTQ people are white, and also that most pedophiles and child molesters are gay. None of these are true and, in fact, are myths nonetheless that are very harmful to this population. The institutions of our society of religion and the family support homophobia and heterocentrism. The family teaches gender roles and expected behaviors to children, those that are preferred, and religion teaches us to see these things as good, necessary, legitimate. Extreme and rigid forms of religion teach that gay people are inherently evil and sinful because they don't fit into these preferred roles and don't exhibit the kinds of behaviors that are acceptable. Some religions also accept homosexuals but condemn any form of homosexual behavior as sinful and resulting in eternal damnation. Biblical references are often quoted to support this notion, but there's those who believe it's a mistaken translation of the Bible to see that. In fact, terms such as homosexuality and sodomy didn't appear in the Bible until the 1940s, and they had no cultural meaning in the period of Hebrew and Greek histories. Homophobia exists and has long existed even within our own helping professionals, and perhaps especially prevalent among social workers over the years. Some who work in the professions allow themselves to be engaged in encouraging reparative or conversion therapies with this belief that sexual minorities can change their orientation if they want to. These conversion therapists use all sorts of different kinds of shaming and emotionally traumatic, physically painful stimuli to make their victims associate those stimuli with their sexual orientation. There are studies that suggest that more than 700,000 LGBTQ people have been subjected to conversion therapy. It is very important that the practitioners validate this minority just like any others. Because of the history of our profession, though, in approaching this population, it may be hard for the professional to develop a trusting relationship with the gay or lesbian client. Persons in the LGBTQ population are harassed or brutalized by people all around them, including family, co-workers, and schoolmates. And there's an extreme story from the early 1990s about a 4-year-old Chicago boy who was burned, stuck with pins and needles, starved, tied up, hung upside down, and gagged by persons within his own family and by those in the neighborhood because they thought he was gay. This boy was 4 years old. Eventually, he was killed by a blow to the head. The National Education Association reported in 2005 that a third of LGBTQ students drop out of school because of harassment, and 4 out of 5 report that they face verbal and physical harassment at school every day. Somewhere between a quarter to nearly a half of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. Crimes against these persons often go unreported because of the stigma for the victim and the family and friends of the victim, and because of the apparent indifference by public officials about the crimes. Many of these children have left home because they've been rejected by their family because of their sexual orientation. The National Institute of Justice studies hate crimes against many different minority populations and has found that gays and lesbians are among the most frequent victims of such crimes. Because of the lack of support in society and its institutions, many persons in this community are taught to hate themselves, and homophobia and homonegativity become internalized as a result. We've again talked about this in relation to the oppression and associated identities with other minority populations as well. So it's vital to understand when working with clients in a clinical setting that this may be occurring with your clients. Such internalization is a norm for gays and lesbians in a heterocentrist society. High rates of suicide and substance abuse that result from this may reflect this self-hate to a certain degree. It's thought that as many as a third of the lesbians and gays have negative attitudes about their homosexuality at some point in their lives. And I'm guessing that's an underestimate. This can manifest itself in many different ways, such as denial of one's own sexual orientation, contempt for those who are public about their sexual orientation, distrust of other gays, getting married to someone of the other sex to gain approval, increased fear and withdrawal from those close to the person, and so on. In part, coming out must involve a neutralization of this internal homophobia. If you're working with a person who is considering coming out, it's very important that you help the individual assess the support systems that exist or do not exist around that person, because the absence of such can make that process much more difficult. Heterosexism, heterocentrism, and homophobia all form the basis of oppression that gays and lesbians, trans, and bisexual people exist in on a day-to-day basis. Such prejudices affect all people, including those who are professionals who provide the health, mental health, social work, and other counseling services that are critical for this population. So we must be very careful to be aware of our own belief systems as we approach work in this area of practice. The social work profession relies upon the ecological perspective and supported by an approach that is sensitive to the various diversity issues that this population faces. This perspective can provide a very effective foundation for work with this population. There's an increasing body of research regarding sexual orientation, but still more focus on the intersectionality of other areas of diversity with sexual orientation is still needed. And the intersection of these diversities needs to be kept in mind when working with the individual if you're going to be effective in working with your clients as individuals. Please let me know if there's any questions that come from this discussion. Otherwise, thanks for listening and stay tuned. Thank you.